Welcome everyone. This is the Build Your AutoCAD IQ webinar, and this is the third dimension series. And today we're going to cover the topic Turning on the Lights in AutoCAD 2017. So welcome. So glad you could join us. This will be presented by Victoria. And let's go to our next page. Victoria is a support specialist out of Manchester. I'll be assisting today out of Lake Oswego. And I don't know that Nauman's joining us today, but he's often with us assisting with our Q&A portion of the webinar. So before we get started, just a few reminders that you're welcome to put questions in the chat window, and we'll try and answer those as time allows. This session will be recorded, and we'll make those links available to you after the webinar. And also we have the links in your reminder email that shows additional webinars and where you can leave feedback. And you see that link, question and answer feedback. You can also post questions after the webinar if we didn't quite cover what you were wanting to find out about or ran out of time. Our webinar series has a lot of features to it, and you'll be able to take on other topics. Coming up here is a list of future topics. You can watch past webinars on YouTube at our link here. All the data sets that Victoria will be featuring today are available at this link. And you can also pursue the topic further through these additional links, such as the forums, online community forums. And of course, our Autodesk Knowledge Network is a great resource for further information, getting specific questions answered, and some assistance with any particular topics or problems that you're encountering with AutoCAD LT or AutoCAD. Again, today's webinar features turning on the lights in AutoCAD 2017, and we see this nice rendering here, and we'll look forward to hearing more information on this topic from Victoria in just a moment. But let's go ahead, as we typically do, and start out with a few quick polls. If you would be so kind as sharing whether this is your first webinar or not. We'll give that just a few more moments, and we'll go ahead and close the poll. So most of you, 95% of you, are returning attendees, and we appreciate you coming back, and some of you are coming to the webinar for the first time, so welcome. Let's go to our next poll. We'd like to know which AutoCAD application you're using, AutoCAD, AutoCAD LT, or one of our verticals there. Give that just a moment, let you finish answering. Most people here are using AutoCAD, and then quite a few on our AutoCAD verticals. So I'll go ahead and close that poll and give you the results there. So one more quick poll, and our third poll regarding lighting. Specifically, do you already use the lighting tools in AutoCAD? So for most of our attendees, Victoria, this is something pretty new, or they've occasionally used them. So this is going to be a very helpful, informative presentation for everyone. So let me go ahead and go to our next slide, and we're going to cover these features today. Just a quick view of our agenda: default lighting, natural versus artificial. We'll cover sun and sky, user-defined lights, and then luminary assemblies. And Victoria provided us some examples here of an exterior of a building in different lighting situations. So on that note, Victoria, we're anxious to see all this in AutoCAD.
Thanks, Martin, for the great introduction. Let me just take I'll take control of the screen here. Okay, here we go. And just let me know when you can see my screen.
Yep, I see it.
Excellent. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really excited to present lighting to you in AutoCAD 2017. So some of you might have models that, that you've either worked on in 3D, maybe you've played around with some of the tools based on some of the things that you've learned in our previous webinars about 3D modeling. Maybe you've played a little bit with the rendering tools, or maybe you just want to learn some new tips and tricks to light your models a little bit better. So my goal here today is to get you started using the basic lighting tools, getting you acclimated with the interface, where to find these tools, and how to get a little bit more realistic renderings out of AutoCAD 2017. So the first thing I'd like to note is that the rendering engine changed in starting with AutoCAD 2016. We went from the old Mental Ray engine to the new Rapid RT engine, and it is a physical renderer, which means that all of the lights are now photometric, or they're processed as photometric lights. So the old standard lights are now obsolete. There are a couple of features that are still in AutoCAD 2017 in order to enable you to go backwards for backwards compatibility reasons. But for the most part, we're going to focus on the features that you want to be using in the current version. So to start here, let me just show you where I am in AutoCAD. I've opened this model here that we'll be using to demonstrate some of the exterior lighting features, or natural lighting. I am in the 3D Basics workspace. So if you click on the workspace gear down in the lower right, you'll see this little flyout, and you have, by default, you're probably in the drafting and annotation workspace. So if you want to follow along, just click over to the 3D Basics. You'll see the ribbon. You'll start on the Home ribbon. I'm going to go over to the Visualize tab on the ribbon. This is where most of the tools that we'll be using are located. We'll be focusing specifically on the Lights panel right here and the Sun and Location panel right here. If we have time at the end, I have a cool little wildcard feature that I'll show you in the materials, but that's sort of a bonus thing. If there's no time, then I'll record a little screencast for you afterwards and send it over with the follow-up email. So I've got this model here, and we might want to light it from the exterior. Now, if you're in AutoCAD and you haven't done anything with lights before, every single model that you have starts with default lighting. And default lighting has two lights. They're distant light sources that follow the viewpoint as you rotate around your model. So if I hold down the Shift key and my middle mouse button and I rotate, you'll notice that the light starts on the left-hand side of the model there, and the right roof is in shadow. But as I rotate, those shadows shift. So those light sources are always coming from the same direction, that lower left to upper right. And so you can't change the position of them, but what this does is if you want to just do a quick render with default lighting enabled, you don't end up with a completely black image. So I'll show you real quick. For presentation purposes, what I've done is rendered a couple of these. I've done all the renders ahead of time so that we're not sitting here waiting for the program to render while I could be teaching you something new. So here is the default lighting from the Southwest isometric view, and then here it is again from the next, it'll be Southeast isometric view. And you'll see that the shadows are coming from, they're being cast in the same direction no matter which way you've rotated your model. So this is useful for a quick render just to see what you're working with, but it's very unrealistic. So the first thing that you typically want to do when you start adding lights to your drawing is to disable that default lighting and start to add your own. So you can either add user-defined lights or sunlight. So we'll start here on the Lights panel. I'll give you a quick tour. There's this Create Light drop down, and that gives you 4 different types of user-defined lights. There are point lights, spotlights, distant lights, and web lights. you have these shadow options, and this is one of those things that is in here for backwards compatibility. You really, since all, with the new renderer, all lights will cast shadows and all objects will cast and receive shadows when you render. So no matter what this is set to, you're always going to get realistic looking shadows in your final render. This will just change the way that the model looks when you're navigating around in AutoCAD. So we're not really going to get into these today, but just know that they're here. So we've got the default lighting toggle, which is right here. You can turn it on and off. You could also use the default lighting system variable and set it to 0, which turns it off, or by default it's set to 1, which means that it's on. You can adjust the exposure and white balance while the default lighting is still on. And what this does is it shows you how much light is applied to the rendered image, and you can brighten it by lowering the number or darken it by increasing the number. You can use this slider here, so you see the, it gets all really washed out. If I bring it up here, it gets really dark. The default is 8.8, so I'm just going to set that back. And then if you look at the white balance, what the white balance does is, so it's measured in Kelvin color temperature, and it changes the tone of the rendered image from either, well, if we go down to, if you decrease the number, you get cooler colors, greens and blues. If you increase the number, you get warmer tones like reds and oranges. There we go. So I'm just going to set that back. The default is 6500. Let's set it back to normal there. And you'll see the model adjust. This right here, the light glyph display, will show your user-defined lights as little light glyphs that can be selected in model space so that you can then change their properties. And this turns them on or off so that they're visible or invisible in your model. And then your lighting units. This looks like an older model. Now this is interesting. By default, right now, by default, the lighting units should be set to international, but since this model was created in an older version of AutoCAD, it was set to 0. So what we can do is change this to international lighting units. That is the default lighting unit. If you want to use American units, you can switch to that. So then American units, just to define it, American units are measured in foot candles, and international units are measured in lux. All right, so I'll tuck that away. The next one over here, we have sun and location. So the sun can be turned on using this status icon. Actually, let me show you distant light first. I want to show you one of the user-defined lights before we jump into the really accurate sun information. So over here on my lights panel, I'm going to click to drop down the create light and pick on distant light. Now distant light has been around for a long time. Before these sun and location settings were in here, distant lights were often used to simulate sunlight in older models. So you can add this, and what it does is it will light your model uniformly. It's really good if you have a model that's really dark and you want to fill the background and you want to just brighten everything all at once. Distant light's pretty good for that. However, it is really difficult to control, so it's kind of an all or nothing light, so it can wash out a model really quickly. But I'll put one in here, and it'll prompt me to turn off the default lighting. So I'll say yes, I want to turn it off because I'm adding user-defined lights. And then this right here is just warning me that the distant lights might overexpose my image because they're all being rendered as photometric lights, as I discussed at the beginning here. That's because of the new rendering engine. So what I'm going to do is allow the distant light just to show you what it looks like, but typically it's recommended to disable them with the new rendering engine. So I'll click on Allow Distant Lights, and this prompts me for a from location, so that's where the light is generated from. I'll just accept the default of 0, 0, 0, and then 2 is where the light is shining towards. So I'll just pick a point up here on the chimney and click on Exit to complete it. And now you'll see that the lighting in the model changes there. I'll zoom in a little bit for you to see. So if I were to render this image, let me show you really quickly what it would look like. So this is my distant light. You'll notice how the whole left side is really blacked out, but you get some light on these other faces over here where the light's hitting. But you can see how this, if you brightened it any more, it would really wash the image out. So you end up with some really, really high contrast looking images. It's just not very realistic. But let's talk about the properties of that first before we move on to sun and location. There is a system variable called, or a command, light list, which will open up the lights in model palette, tool palette here. This will show all of the lights in your model, and here we can pick on the distant light, and I will right click it, and I can either delete the light from the model or select properties. I just want to select properties so that we can talk about this a little bit. I'm going to bring it out here, and just so that you can see everything all at once here. Okay, these are all of the properties available to you for distant lights. You can name it. I highly recommend naming all of your lights, because as soon as you start adding, point light and distant light and web lights, they can get out of control really fast. It's hard to remember which one is which. So if you give them very unique names, it's much easier to keep track of them and adjust them, make minor adjustments later when your model gets complicated. This type is distant, but it's read-only. You can't change this here. It just tells you what kind of light you're working with. You can turn it on or off. You can change the intensity factor of that light and the filter color. You can also change lamp intensity or lamp color. But other than that, oh, and then you can change the to and from vectors, or you can just change the source vector if you know the angle at which you want your vector to come from to hit your model. So I'm just going to close this out. We'll talk about some more of these properties when we get to the other types of light. I'm going to delete this distant light from my model. All right. And just make sure that default lighting is still disabled. And from here, what I'm going to do is turn the sun status on. This dialog just lets me know that there are different exposure settings that are recommended for sunlight. So I'm going to go ahead and just have those settings auto-adjusted there. And you see the model change a little bit. Okay, so the first thing that you'll want to note about the about enabling the sun is that you end up with a horizon in the distance, but not until you turn the perspective on. So if you're sitting here in parallel orientation, you'll notice that the sky is off, but you can't change this to turn the sky on if you wanted to. It's locked out. You can come over here to the view cube, click on that arrow in the lower right, and pick the perspective. And that'll give you a more realistic view of your model to begin with by enabling perspective. And then you get access to a little more control over the sky background. So right here with the sky off, if I were to render this, it would look a little dark because it's not emulating a realistic sky background. So what turning on sky background and illumination does is it emulates the way that light actually refracts in the atmosphere when the sunlight comes through it and then hits your model. So I have a couple of renders here to show you the difference. This right here was rendered at the same time of day in the same location, just with the sky off. And then this is the same thing, just with the sky turned on. And so you get a much more realistic looking render if you turn the sky on. So now I've done that. The next thing is to set your model in an accurate geographic location. So if you know that your model is, I'm going to use our Boston office location as an example. You can use the geographic location tools within AutoCAD to set the location of your model and put it into to those real coordinates so that the sunlight will be accurately emulated for the time and date that you designate. So you have two options here. The bottom one here, you can use a KMZ or a KML file, which just have, they're importing GIS coordinates that you might already have on hand. We're going to demonstrate the first option here, which is to use this from map option. So I'll click on from map and it brings me into the geographic location tool. I've already used this once this session when I was practicing ahead of time. There is a notification that will come up and tell you that you need to be logged in to Autodesk 360 in order to access this. And you can do that up here in the right-hand corner where it says I'm logged in, V Studley. You can just drop down this this arrow and there'll be an option to log in. So once you're logged in, you'll see this map come up. And up here, I'm just going to type in the address, 23 Dry Dock, Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm going to drop the marker. And if it looks accurate, just click Next. Looks good. And then it's going to populate a list of GIS coordinate systems for me. I'm just going to pick the top one. If you know which specific one you need for your site, then go ahead and pick that out of the list. And then it's going to ask me to pick the location for the model. I'm just going to pick this lower corner and accept the default for the north angle. If you knew this ahead of time and you knew that the north angle was 90 degrees or 260 degrees on your model or something, you could set that up. It might be a little easier to set up in plan view ahead of time, but we'll just walk through this really quickly. Now you'll notice that the map will start to generate in front of me, but I don't really need the map for rendering purposes. I might add a background later or something like that, but I don't want to render the map. So I'm going to come up in here. You'll notice I'm on the geolocation contextual ribbon tab that came in here as soon as I started using the map features. I'll scroll down to the bottom and just turn the map off. And once you've inserted this location, the sun settings will remember that location for you. So now we can be done with this geolocation tab. We'll go back over to visualize, and you'll see that that map marker is still in the drawing. Now from here, you come back onto the sun and location panel, and you can either use the sliders to adjust the date and the time, or what I prefer to do is open up the sun properties. So here are my sun properties, and this will show me that the sun is on. It'll show me the intensity factor of the sun, the color of the sun. I typically just leave these alone because they do accurately model what the sun's intensity would be at a particular geographic location based on the azimuth, the altitude, and your source vector. So these are generated from that geographic location. So down here, I'm going to set the date to today. See that this picker I find to be a little easier, but whatever works for you. I'll just double click on May 12th and it populates, and you notice that the background changes a little bit to reflect these settings. And then let's just change this to 7 a.m. and we'll take a look at what this looks like. Oh, where'd I go? There's 7. So if I pick 7 a.m., it gets darker. That's just as the sun's starting to rise, right? And if I pick, like, let's say 11 a.m., this is what it starts to look like here. And if I go to 3 p.m., you see that sunlight shift around the model. And if I go up to like 7 p.m., you'll start to see the evening light. Now this, when you're looking at this in model space as you're just adjusting the settings, I am in realistic mode. Let me just close these panels for a second. Up here in my upper left, you'll see that I'm in the realistic visual style. Typically, this does show you a rough approximation of what the lighting effects will look like, but they're not totally accurate to what the render will look like in the end. So let me show you what that'll look like. Here was 7 a.m. with the sky on in that same location, and there's 7 p.m. and there's 2:30 in the afternoon. So you see the sun just shifts around the model there. So those are sun and location settings in AutoCAD 2017, as well as default lighting and distant lights. If we don't have any quick questions, I know that we are rushing right through this, but I do have a lot more to show you. Martin, do we have anything pressing? Or Alex?
No pending questions at this time, Victoria.
Excellent. All right. I'm just going to close out this model. These will be in the data set, so if you guys want to check them out after, you can. Just download them from that box site. I will try to remember to send out the email. I got a lot of great responses from people last week when we sent out the data sets and links via email. So thank you all for your responses. I was glad to hear back from you all. All right, so from here, let's jump into this user-defined lights file. We will talk about point lights and spotlights in this particular one. So in this model, I just have, you might recognize this from a previous webinar, I just have, I've added a ceiling since we last used it, just to emulate an actual room. But I will hold down my shift and middle mouse button and just orbit a little bit so you can see we're just using, a couple simple materials, a table, and a window with some glass in it. Let's say that I want to add a couple of lights within this room. We're going to add a point light and we're going to add a spotlight, and I'll show you the difference between the two of them. I just want to check my light list. I'll open up my light list again. My lights in model. So you can see I have no lights in this model yet. My default lighting is disabled. So I'll go to the Create Light ribbon dropdown, and I'll just select Point Light. Now the point light, point lights don't have a target. They just illuminate everything around them in all directions. Think of them like a candle or a light bulb hanging on a string. So if I add a point light to my model, I'm just going to add it. I'll add it right in here, and we can move it later. You see that this lights up the model inside. It gets a, makes a, washes out the floor a little bit. It illuminates the wall just a little bit, and it dissipates as it goes. So unlike those distant lights that don't, the light doesn't dissipate over time, or I always say time, the light doesn't dissipate over distance. Point lights do dissipate over distance. So you see it get darker and darker the farther away from the light you get. It's a little more realistic than a distant light. So if I'm having trouble selecting this in the model, you can see I ended up selecting that wall. Quick trick is to go into the Lights in Model panel palette and click it there, and you'll see that it selects it in the model for me, so I don't have to play, try to pick the light over and over again. So from here, I can right-click on it and say Properties. From here, I can turn that, let's say I want to turn the glyph off. You notice that the glyph disappears. I can still select the light. So I'll turn the glyph back on just so you can see where it is. And then we'll open up the properties. And I'll move the properties over here. I want you to be able to see them as I work with them, but also see the light glyph here and how the model changes. Okay, so in the properties palette, you'll see the name of the light. So you might want to rename this to something very specific, light on table. maybe it's point light on table, but once you come into the properties, you can see very clearly that it's point light. Now, as opposed to the distant light, point light, you can actually change the type of light it is from a spotlight, from a point light to a spotlight or a web light. So those three types are interchangeable. You can turn it on and off. You can change the intensity factor, the filter color. Here, I'll show you. 0.5 intensity will drop the intensity of the light. So you get less light that way. And you see that you can now start to see the pattern in the floor. It's not quite as washed out. You can change the filter color, change it to something like 205. You get more warm tones. Change it to that gray color and it really starts to look darker. If you wanted, for some reason, to plot the light glyphs when you plot and you want them to show up on your final plot, you can turn those on. I've never found a real use for them, but I'm sure it's there for a reason and somebody's had a reason to plot them. Here's your glyph display. You can turn it on or off. You can change the lamp intensity. This is measured in candelas. And if you open up, you click on that little icon, it'll open up the lamp intensity dialog box. You can change whether or not the intensity is measured in, or you can change this from intensity to flux to illuminance. I'm just going to leave it at the default here. You can also change the intensity factor in here. Let's see what happens if I drop this down to like 500 candelas. Okay, so you see it gets darker. And I'm going to brighten it up so it doesn't look like a big black screen for you. Put it back to 1500 and I'm going to change my color, my lamp color back to white. And change my intensity back to like 1. So that's the default there. So you can see that I can quickly change the way that the light looks in the model and how it's being cast just by adjusting some of these, playing with some of the settings. You can also change the lamp color based on some of these presets. The fluorescent light might look a little, I mean, that definitely looks more fluorescent. It's got that yellowy color to it. Xenon takes on that true white looking color. Or Mercury takes on that greenish blue hue. So you can change those and get some really quick ideas of what the light or how the light will affect your final render. One other thing that you can change here is the position. So let's say I didn't really like that it's sitting on top of the table. Maybe I want this to be a little higher. I can change this to maybe 4 feet. And you'll notice that now that it's up above, it's a little softer on the floor and you can get a little bit more light on the table and the details there. Let me select that one more time. Down the bottom, it talks about attenuation. The only thing you need to know about attenuation to start with is that all of the lights in AutoCAD 2017 are processed as photometric lights, which means that the attenuation is always calculated as an inverse square. I'm not going to get into the technicalities of that. We could probably talk all day about attenuation. But just if you want to look it up later, there's plenty of documentation on it, and I'll provide a couple of links in the data set afterwards. All right, so that is a point light, and what I'm going to do here is just, I don't want to delete it from the model, I just want to turn it off so that we can talk about a different kind of light. So tuck this to the side. There we go. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is spotlights. Now, spotlights go in sort of like a point light, except a spotlight has a target. So let's say I start my, maybe I want to, oh, it's going to prompt me for a source location. So I'm going to start it at this upper left-hand corner, and then I'm going to point it at a particular location. So I want to aim it at the table. I'm just going to pick a spot on the table and exit, and it'll give me a default spotlight with all the default settings in it. Okay, so now we have this spotlight. It looks a little dark. I'm going to select it, and then it should open up in the properties here, and we'll talk about the properties of that spotlight. We'll move the model over so you can see it. Okay. So now that we have our spotlight, you can see that it has a couple of rings, a couple of cones of light. The first one, the one on the outside is the fall off, and the one on the inside is called the hot spot. So the closer the hot spot and the fall off are to each other, the harder line you're going to get between light and darkness in your model. So you get a really hard ring of light if they're right on top of each other. The farther away you move them from each other, the softer it's going to be. So the softer transition from that cone, that inner hotspot cone, and where the light stops. So I'll demonstrate that for you here. So again, I would rename this, spotlight, whatever. I could turn it on and off. Now here's my hotspot angle. I can change this. Let's say I only want it to be like 5 degrees. And you notice that inner cone got really, really narrow. So you get a really hot spot on the table there. And then if I change the fall off angle to, let's say 60, it'll get wider, and I'll get a really soft transition between that hot spot and where the light fades to complete darkness. So you can change the intensity factor. Maybe this is a little dark for us. We want, intensity factor of 2, or let's try 5, and we'll get real close to the model in a second. Okay, so we'll come in here. Now that we know where that hot spot is. So again, this isn't really showing the light as accurately as it would when it renders. It's just giving a rough approximation. So I don't want to do it in the middle of the demo here, but if I rendered this, you'd see a nice bright spot on the table here, and where this cone is. You can adjust the hotspot by pulling these as well, pulling the grips. So maybe I want a smaller hotspot. So it's still not showing that bright spot on the model, but once you render, you'll see a very hot spot, and then it'll fade out to the fall off. Let's just pull the fall off in. I'm going to grab, I lost my light. I'm just going to grab it from my list. And you see the little arrow there? I'm just going to grab the arrow for my fall off. Maybe I want to pull it into here. Oh, no, it went too far out. Okay. So if you see that, if you're trying to adjust the grips and it doesn't work for you, go back into that properties panel, the properties palette, and you can adjust that fall off there. Maybe I want this to be 5 degrees. There we go. So that shows it a little more accurately. You get that little spot on the floor there. Maybe I can make it a little more intense so that you can see it. I can change the filter color again. Okay. So again, a lot of the same properties are available here. The only difference with the spotlight is that you have the control over the hot spot and the fall off angle. So I won't repeat myself on those. If we have time at the end, I'll come back and show you a render with that hot spot on there. I just don't want to do it in the middle of the presentation here. So let's switch over to the next file. So the last thing here that I want to talk about before we get into Luminary Assemblies, if we have a couple of minutes to talk about them, is web lights. So that would be the fourth user-defined light. In this model, you'll see that I have the same exact model, but I've added some of these, these strange-looking glyphs here. And let me show you. I'm going to pop into 2D wireframe for a second and zoom in. Check these out. They're kind of weird looking, right? So you get that really weird looking shape. This one's got a weird like hot air balloon look to it. This one's very, very skinny. And this one's got a weird asymmetrical shape to it. Now this one over on the right, these are all web lights, by the way. They're all web lights that I've added to this model. Web lights are probably the most realistic way for you to show light in your model and render a really realistic image. Let me show you an example quickly. These are both rendered with web lights. Now you'll see them up on the wall. Each one of them has a different shape that it casts for light, different intensity, and a different shape. And I've rendered it here with a couple of Martin's plants from the last 3D demo we did here. And you can see that they cast those accurate shadows onto the floor, onto the walls, onto the window. But they have those different light shapes to give you an accurate representation of what your lights would look like in real life. So these web files, the files that I use to create the shape of the web come from manufacturers. So let's get back. Let me dial it back to inserting a web light here. Same way that you would insert another light, we'll just select the web light option and your asked for location. Now the web light goes wherever you want it to go. If I wanted to place it over here, I could place it over here, and you get this red glyph. So this one right here is the default, and I left one on the wall there just so that I could show you in the render what this default web light looks like when you render it. So let's select this one. You'll notice they show up in the model here. I'm just going to mouse over the properties. So here's my web light. Again, you can change the type if you want to go back to a spotlight or a point light. You can. You can turn it on and off. You can change the intensity, the color, all of the same things that you can change in the other lights you can change here. The really interesting thing about web lights is that you can add a web file that describes the shape of the light. And it's as if you took a light bulb or a light fixture and put it inside a box and then measured in 360 degrees what that light was doing. So maybe off to the left in the middle, it went out, 2 inches, and then straight up it might have gone out 3 inches, and I've never done these tests in a lab environment or anything, but this is a pretty good way to picture how those measurements are done. So here you can add a web file by clicking on this little icon, and what I've done is I've downloaded a bunch of IES web files from a manufacturer, and they are there are some default ones installed with AutoCAD. If you want to access them, they're in your program data file. Let me just show you real quick. So if you go to your C drive, program data, Autodesk, AutoCAD 2017, R21, ENU, web files, there are some sample ones that you can use here. So here's a linear cove light. Now you'll see on this graph the shape of the light that's emitted from that particular fixture is illustrated here. Here's what a linear pendant looks like. Here's a point recessed medium. It looks like 75 watts. And here's a wall washer. It's very similar, right? But there's that second little cone for this one. There's another recessed light, 250 watts. It's got that really strange looking shape. So each one of these lights generates an IES file, and manufacturers publish these. You can download them from their website and then use them with your lights in AutoCAD. So let's just take a look at what that sconce looks like. We'll say OK. And then over here, you can see that the sconce, that red orb now changed to the IES shape that sconce represents in real life. I'm going to switch back to 2D wireframe because it lets me zoom in on it so you can see exactly what it looks like. Then I'll select it. Oh, okay, well it disappeared. But that's the 3D representation of that file at any rate. All right, so those are web lights. I'll show you that rendering again. So this is what I put a couple of samples in. These are what those shapes look like when they're up on the wall. This is that default one over on the right-hand side. And you'll see that it has a much more natural look to each of these lights. You can customize them. All right, so let's say you have a light fixture and you want to create a luminary, what we call luminary assembly. You want to insert a block that has a light and then it maybe has a lampshade around it or something. We can do that by creating a luminary assembly and then inserting it into the file. And in order to do that, I have to open up, I wasn't sure we were going to get this far, so this should be kind of cool. I'll open up these two files. All right, so what I have done here is I've created the same file twice. I've just created this is a 3D object. I extruded a square and then as a surface and then thickened it to an 1/8 inch thick. This is a 6x6 square extruded 1 foot. And then inside of it, I'm just going to rotate down to show you. In this one I have a point light. So again, I'm trying to select that and it doesn't work. Go back over to my Lights in Model palette, select that point light, right click on it and go to Properties. You can see the properties of this particular light. Now, I'm not afraid to render anymore because we've hit the portion in the presentation where it's going to be okay if we lock it up a little bit. So we'll have some fun. I've set this to low in this particular file so that we can, this will be the lowest quality render. It should be pretty quick. So cross your fingers and hope that this works. So we'll click on it, we'll render, we'll see the render window, and this is what that looks like. Now you could insert this file as a block into another file and have, you know, one of these cloth shaded lamps or something. The way that I did this was to create a material that is self-illuminating. So this is that little extra bit that I was going to add in with the materials panel here. So if I open up my materials browser, I have this beige fabric. I'm going to rename this one. We'll edit it first. We'll call this beige loom. This way I know that this is my illuminating material. I'll show you what I started with, because I started with a material from the Autodesk Materials library that does not, I think it's in the fabrics. I started with a material that does not self-illuminate, and then I turned it into a self-illuminating material. So there it is, beige. I'm going to click this arrow here to add it to my model. You'll see it show up in my document materials. And then from here, that's my self-illuminating one. Okay, so this is my regular material here from the Autodesk Materials library. If I drag and drop this onto the model, and then I do that render again, you'll just get that you know, the light is inside, the point light is inside this model, but it can't penetrate it, so it can't illuminate that object to make it look like it's glowing the way a lampshade would. So in order to do that, what you can do is copy the material over, name it to something that you're going to remember, like beige loom, and then you'll come in here and adjust the settings. So what I did here was I selected this self-illumination checkbox. Fabric materials are able to be self-illuminated. You'll notice that some objects or some types of materials can't be self-illuminated. Usually like the metallic ones I think aren't able to be. So you'll have to go in and find one that's like fabric or something like that. I know this one works. Okay, so from here I changed the filter color because, as I'll show you in a second here, I'm going to copy this so that I remember what it was. I'm just going to change my filter color back to white, and I'll show you what happens in a moment. So here's my filter color that I changed, and then I changed this to a lampshade exterior look, and I changed this to an incandescent bulb. And these are the properties that you can adjust to get a different look for your self-illuminating material. I also added a level of transparency to this, 30%, which I will disable in order to show you what this looked like beforehand. So the first thing you'll do is come in and check self-illumination. And then I'm going to drag this back onto here. So if we render it, it comes out all washed out like this. So it looks a little strange. But I do have that self-illumination. You notice it wasn't just a black render with a little light coming out of the top of the fixture. So we're getting closer. The second thing that I'll do is change this filter color back to that really dark. And this is a trial and error thing. I went through and I just picked one that looked kind of like what I wanted. So now that it won't let me change it. There we go. There we go. Okay, so I've changed my filter color. And we'll take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so this is starting to look closer, but let me get you a better look at it. So you can see the illumination at the top, but it just looks like a big tan blob. I want it to look like the light's coming through the fabric a little bit. So if I come in and I add transparency, I'm going to add 30% transparency to this, and you can just slide this over and render on low quality to get a quick look at what this material is going to look like. And there I start to get a little bit of light scatter through that material to make it look like it's illuminating from the light within. So those are self-illuminating materials. I also wanted to show you the difference between this one and one that I've done with a web light. Let me close all of my tool palettes here. Got a little tool palette crazy. All right, so this one here was done with a web light with the same settings. And so that web light gives you a little bit more of that scattered look. It just has a little bit more realistic looking light scatter over a point light. All right. I think I have one more rendering. Where did it go? I thought I had a rendering with it in it. I did add that light to a particular render. Let me go back. There it is. Okay. So that's what that render looks like. I don't remember if this is the one with the point light or the web light, but you can get a feel for what that looks like. You can see that it's casting some of that soft yellow glow on the floor, and then take a look at the that light shape on the ceiling there that you would see in real life if you had a light fixture like this in your model. The last thing that I want to recommend is that you guys try out that the rendering service. When I was trying to go through the renders for this, I was tying up my machine trying to come up with these really nice looking renders to show you guys today. And I rendered it overnight, and I got up in the morning and was like, that's a long time to tie up my machine. Why don't I try the rendering service? And it worked out really nicely. It came out with nice renders like this. I'll send you guys these pictures or these images in the data set so you can take a look at the quality of them, but I had a really good experience with it. All right, so that's about all I have. Martin, do you want to wrap up the PowerPoint presentation? And then if there's a little bit of time for Q&A, we might have a couple minutes left over.
Sure. Yeah, that was fun.
All right.
Great stuff.
I'll give you the screen. There you go.
Okay. So just a quick note, we do have lots of additional resources. If you want to pursue this further, go ahead and download the slide deck from the link, and you can get links to all these additional resources here. So we appreciate you joining us. There's more links for following up, signing up for other webinars listed here and also in the slide deck. So let's go ahead and do our last poll real quick. And we'd like to know if you learned something new in this webinar today. Give you a moment to finish answering. And Victoria, we got 100%. That's awesome. Learned something new. So
I think that's a first for me.
Yeah.
I'm glad everybody learned something. That's awesome.
So we do have maybe just a minute or two if there are any lingering questions. I don't see anything pending in the Q&A list, but Nauman, did you have any additional open questions?
No, actually, I had answered a few of them itself, and basically there were a couple of questions mentioned about rendering, but the settings of rendering and how we can tweak the different settings of how much the render, the light bounces between the objects. So if Victoria can touch on the render presets.
Oh, so the render presets is something that I really want to cover in a future webinar. Could you guys send in some questions that you wanna learn about rendering? It could be cloud rendering, it could be the new rendering engine and those exposure settings and that sort of thing. I am not prepared to answer questions about the rendering portion of things today, but I am looking forward to preparing a webinar in the very near future about that.
And we only have about a minute left, so.
Yeah, it's a really complicated topic, but it's such a cool topic, especially with the new tools. They're a lot easier to use. I've played around a lot with them, but they are a little too complicated, I think, to get into in the last 3 minutes of this webinar here. Well, let me show you my screen real quick, and I'll give you like a minute tour, if that's something I can do. Clean screen. There we go. All right, let me know when you can see.
Yep.
All right, this is going to be like a super quick on the fly, don't hold this against me tour, all right? So on the Visualize tab of the ribbon, all the way over on the right-hand side, there's this rendering panel. You can change your rendering size here by clicking on the rendering dropdown. There are a bunch of preset ones where you can open up more output settings and change your settings here. I am not going to delve into all of these settings, but they are pretty self-explanatory. They're just the output settings that you're going to get, the final image. Here are a bunch of presets that come with every drawing. Low, medium, and high are old holdovers from the old Mental Ray rendering engine. The new coffee break, lunch, and overnight quality are new presets that come with all drawings based on the new Rapid RT engine. If you go to Manage Render Presets, it'll open your Render Presets Manager. You'll get the option to change whether you're rendering directly in a window. That was what I was doing, where the window popped up directly in the viewport, or you can select a region, so you just, draw a window over the portion of the drawing you want to render. That's pretty good for test renders if you just want to do a very small section. You can change the render size here as well. There's your presets. You can create a new preset based on one of these and then adjust your, you can name it something new, give it a description. You can render until satisfactory, which just means that it's going to render forever and ever and ever until you stop it. Render by level or render by time. So this is a fixed time. This is just a number of passes that the renderer does over your model. Quality or render accuracy, low, medium, and high quality, basically. Oh, what did I miss? I feel like I missed something. This is very fast. Rendering in the cloud is here. Render gallery, render environment and exposure. This is a whole webinar all in and of itself. I did not want to get into IBL today and environment. One more thing, I have it open, so I might as well show you. This is rendering.360.autodesk.com. This is where I did a lot of the renders that you saw today. Not these ones, but I'm going to try to play this sun study for you of that model. This just shows you how the sun changes over the course of a day. So there's a couple of cloud credits to do that, I think. Once you get the model uploaded, you can enable this sun study. and it'll create you a file. And then this one was the that final render that I did. Once you're in here, you can change your render settings and adjust, what do you call it? Just adjust your settings here based on what you want for a final output.
That's awesome. We're at the
All
top
right.
of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Victoria.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Okay.